worked with thousands of parents, schools, and children around the globe. Dr. Lisa is an attorney, a clinical psychologist, and an author. And she's the founder and director of the Digital Citizen Academy, one of the first organizations to address the global issue of technology addiction and overuse. As a licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Strohman has spent more than a decade working with individuals, families, and adolescents struggling with issues including depression, anxiety, addiction, and technology overuse. So I think this is a relevant topic for all of us. And so today I'm going to give you an outline of the conversation. We're going to start with a conversation about technology in general. Where are we with technology? We're going to talk about technology and children and teens in particular. What are we seeing post-pandemic? And what are ways that we can help children and teens? And then I don't want you to zone out at that if you don't have any children or teens in your life, because the next part we're going to talk about is technology basically for all of us, but in particular technology with older adults. And what are the ways that technology, social media, the internet can spell danger for older adults as well. And then, because we're a good church, we're Christians, we always end on hope. We're not going to end you there with the bad news about how terrible everything is. We're going to end with some hope. What can we do? What can we as a faith community do to help protect our kids and our teens and all of us? And then what can you as parents and grandparents and family members do to help those around you? Okay, are you in? You're in? Sound good? Okay. Well, I want to start with, I have so many props in my hand, so I'm just going to get rid of all of them here at the beginning. Dr. Lisa is the author of 2 books. One is Unplug, Raising Kids in a Technology-Addicted World. And her newest book is Digital Distress, Growing Up Online. And this has a specific focus on Gen Z and what they're experiencing, as it says, growing up online. So I recommend these to you. We're going to talk about some of the content in here, but I always like to have a prop to begin. So there you go. Okay. So to start with, I think it's really important that we kind of outline our terms and what we're talking about. What I don't want you to hear in this conversation is that all technology is bad. This is not a presentation that's going to turn the whole church into Luddites, where you're going to go outside. I mean, maybe. It might happen. But that's not our goal. Because I think it's really important to say in any conversation about technology, technology itself is somewhat neutral. Technology is like a tool. A hammer is completely neutral. It's all about who's using it and what they're using it for. It's the same with a lot of our technology. But what we're going to talk about today is the particular use of social media and some of the internet technologies. Social media and internet technologies and how they can be used. And that's what we're going to see as we get into particularly the use of social media with children and teens. These are not neutral tools. That they are, I'm jumping ahead. We'll get there. So first of all, I just want to say, welcome, Dr. Lisa.
Thanks.
I'm really glad
Happy
that you're
to be
here. Lisa came all the way from Arizona to Charlotte, and I think is starting to love Charlotte. And
I am.
yeah, she was here recently for a Novant event, and where some of you might have heard her speak. It's actually where our own Alice DeVries heard Dr. Lisa and said, we have to get her here. So I think the first thing we should talk about as we get in, and I want to warn you here, we're going to get into some slides that have a lot of data, and we're going to really get into the weeds. One thing I love about Dr. Lisa is that she knows her stuff, and she's got all the data to back it up. And so we're going to jump into that pretty quickly. One thing we know about the world today is that technology is everywhere, social media is everywhere. I think everyone in the room pretty much has a smartphone in their pocket, would be a safe assumption. And we're starting to see a really interesting phenomenon. We're starting to see kids getting access to technology and social media at a much younger and younger age. I remember when I got my first cell phone, and it was, I'm going to date myself here, I got it when I was 16, but that was before apps and all of that kind of stuff. And I got it as a very practical tool because my parents knew I'd be out driving by myself. But more and more, I think technology has changed. Kids are getting access much earlier, and that's presenting some new issues that we might not think about automatically. And so I wonder if we can just start at the early point in life with childhood and what's happening when we're giving technology to young kids.
Well, I think when you look at the attachment styles, thank you all for coming, by the way. I'm happy to be here with all of you. But when we give technology to really, really young children, like I look at it from developmental stages. So an infant, for instance, is a perfect example. There's all of these tools out there that new parents can get. So one of them is if your child or your infant is crying, if the infant, I use my hands all the time, I'll put coffee everywhere. So if you put this tool inside the baby's nursery and the baby cries, it'll automatically turn on with music and lights that are projected onto the ceiling. And presumptively, if you think about that as a parent, it might give you a little bit more time to sleep, right? That you're not having to get up when the child's crying. But what it does from a psychological perspective at that age, and we may not think of it, is that the child now is branding my need as being met by something that isn't human, and it's not that we're giving them entertainment. We're actually bringing them into a space where they're trusting someone that's not there, which has to do with attachment. And so those very, very young children we're already starting to see that grew up on these kind of devices or iPoddies or things like that really struggle in having normal peer relationships, have trouble in school. So it starts very much in the very, very beginning.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to advance through these just so we can have those up on the screen.
So in toddler age, like really when you're thinking about that, that's when they're supposed to go out and explore. It's where, as you know, with young children, it's exhausting, and Emma, where she is, right? Yeah. It's an exhausting period of time, but the whole point of that toddler period is to go out, try something, fail, do something great, and then come back. And so again, if your child isn't doing those really in real life experiences, and they're on a device that's constantly wired to give them that positive reaction, they're not learning a negative reaction at any time. So those toddlers really need to have less time. I'm kind of a teetotaler on little kids on devices because I think that we all too often can slide into putting them on too long. And then the preschooler that's when they leave us for the first time and they go out into the world, and that's really where you start to see whether or not they've been on the devices too much. And the teachers that I have worked with in the past say that they can really tell fundamentally a child who presents that has been raised on technology versus one that hasn't, because they're wired differently, they act differently, they don't have the same skill sets as the other one, really from that little kind of age of 4 and 5. Wow. So, and then elementary school, I guess, would be the next stage, and elementary school is really a tough time because that's really, in the United States, the average age is 6 for a child to have what they consider their own device, and that's usually because they have a parent or an older sibling that doesn't have a phone or doesn't need to use a phone. It's an older version, and the parents think because it just doesn't have self-service that it's fine to hand over to them. But in reality, as long as they're near a Wi-Fi router, they can get Wi-Fi wherever they are. And so that age is where I start to see the aggression and some of the relationship issues. And then the teenage years are like the dumpster fire years. I have 2 in my house that live with me, and I occasionally am friendly with them, but
that makes me feel better.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And we'll get into some more detail on teenagers and social media in particular. What's so fascinating, did y'all hear the average age that kids are given their first device? Did you ever say 6 years old? And I just think that's fascinating. As the parent of a 4.5-year-old, I think the impulse is there. I see the what you named, the parental motivation to get an extra hour of sleep, or to have the child quiet for an hour. But I don't think we realize the kind of impact and the dominoes that fall afterwards. I think that's one thing that's true of every single technology. There's a great book out by a guy named Andy Crouch that talks about technology and kind of the spiritual side of our technology use. And he makes a point that I hadn't thought about until I read the book, that every technology we're given is a trade-off. That it says, yes, we can now do certain things with this technology, but inherent in that is now you can't do other things, or it changes how you interact with other things. And I think we're kind of in this phase now with technology. We were talking last night at dinner that particularly with handheld technology, social media, and all those things, we're running the largest uncontrolled experiment in human history. Because we just invented all of it and gave it to everyone, and we don't know what it does. There were no clinical trials of Facebook before Facebook was given to everyone. But I think now we're seeing, and we're going to get into some of the data, the results of the experiment are coming in. And it's troubling. It's troubling what this is doing. And so I hope you don't hear any shaming of parents for giving kids devices or technology, because I have done it, I've been there. But I hope what you're hearing is a call to be a little more discerning, to think through what we're doing. And so I wonder, we'll jump to this next slide about the stages of development, and particularly where social media and technology is kind of entering the picture.
Yeah, so with the psychosocial, this is back to attachment. When you're looking at where we become adults and how we successfully get there, you have these two sides. And what was interesting to me, and I don't know of anyone else that's talking about overlaying when children are getting the technology with these stages, but the part that they are now handing devices on truly is that industry versus inferiority stage, right? And that part is where am I a competent, and if you want to go to the next slide that has it, but the competent, and am I doing good? Children want to do good. They want to be successful at things. And so if you think about at this elementary school age, they're going through, and if they're not getting a resolve to understand that they have been successful, and let me play it out for you. You go to school, you show up in your class, your teacher asks you to do a paper, you turn in your paper and you go out to recess, right? Those are all things that we're following along in those things. So now take an elementary school child who has a cell phone or is on a social media platform, and as they go out into the online world and they start to interact with somebody, they start to be bullied, or they start to have people that send them things that are scary to them, and they're not sure. And so now they're going out in the world in that same vein, but they're not getting back that industry where they feel competent, right? They're not getting the feedback that they need in order to go through that stage. So that's why I overlay these stages with when we're handing them the devices. Once you become a teenager, then you're looking at role confusion. This is, the who am I stage of, this is middle school, 7th grade, pretty much into like high school. But you see, and I've been a therapist for 18 years, psychologist, and I see teenagers, which is, kind of riding by the seat of your pants, when they come in. But I have seen a fundamental change in my teenagers, my clients coming into my office over the last even just 5 years. And there's been a shift that has occurred industry-wide in the social media world. The algorithms that they have created have changed. When it first came out, it was all about who our friend group was, and it would give us the feed of what they were doing. And then somewhere along the line, I think it was in 2006, 2008, something like that, they shifted it, and they created the algorithm that said, we're going to suggest to you who you should be. And all of us may remember, it's like, we think you might like this person as a friend because it was a friend of a friend. And once that started happening, now our children are being indoctrinated with what the industry feels that they should look at. And so in the state for them, this identity, who am I, it's no longer the primary family, which used to be mom and dad, grandparents were number one, educational systems, their school setting was two, and third was community church. And now their primary source is online. And so when you look at these kids, it's the feed that comes to them as their primary source of am I good or not? And it's outsourcing us as parents at that very critical age, and which is sad. I mean, the good news is teenagers actually are pretty amenable, and as much as they manipulate us, I do a really good job manipulating them back. I'm very practiced. And so just teaching them that they're being used in these products and then being manipulated on their end frustrates and angers them. And so it's facilitating that. We're going to talk about that at the end. And then the young adult intimacy versus isolation. This is where our kids should be going out in college and finding out if they can fall in love and be vulnerable with somebody else and be authentic to who they are and really trust in someone to create a relationship. This is the first time in history we have a generation of kids that aren't getting married, aren't having children, aren't interested in that. And it's interesting how the media talks about it, and my belief is that we have failed them in prepping them to be in this stage. And that's fundamentally one of the reasons why, is because they're going on these online dating apps and trying to meet people where they're getting rejections after rejections after rejection. And so that vulnerability that they're sharing is not what they need. So.
Yeah. Wow. Like taking a deep breath. But you see what I was talking about at the beginning, that there are kind of neutral tools, and then there's things and a lot of this technology that is no longer neutral, that the algorithm has changed. I think we can often have this myth of social media at the beginning when it really was just a list of friends, and it was a place to see what your friends were up to. And you remember when Instagram was just food? It was like people taking pictures of the dinner they cooked. And it's not that anymore. Or if it is, it looks like a 5-star chef cooked every single meal. And so I think, I say that lightly, but we need to be really honest that this technology is not neutral anymore. And not to sound like I don't think it's a conspiracy theory at all, but social media apps are profit-driven things. They may say they have the highest motive of connecting people across the world, but you've probably heard it. Did y'all watch the documentary The Social Dilemma when it came out? But there's a phrase in there they say that if you're not paying for something, then you're the product. And no one pays for social media. And so you have to start asking the question of what's going on, and what you named about the algorithm. They just dial the algorithm up for engagement. And the cost is the well-being of us and our teens. And so the next slide shows, in a pretty explicit way, what's happened when all of these social media platforms were introduced on people's well-being. So if we want to...
Yeah, so I am fairly nerdy, and so I do like the data, but I don't know if I can see what the top line is. I think the top...
Oh, no.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I told you the coffee was going to go. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
I can't be trusted. So I think that the top line is the self-harm, and the bottom line is, make sure, suicidal thoughts. Or no, sadness and hopelessness is the top blue line, and suicidal thoughts is the bottom line. So the CDC, for all, we can love them or hate them after the pandemic, but they do gather data in strong ways. And so this is of 12 to 14-year-olds, and they come through and they talk about where we are in society. So just like we were just talking about with the attachment and like figuring out what's happening with our kids and these algorithms that are putting them in these areas, when you put people in these areas and you manipulate them into doing these things, we as humans naturally want to get through those stages. That's why to me, it's so important to bring that conversation into it. We want, if something's going wrong in our life, we want to fix it. We want to feel better. And so what the algorithms have decided or have found out is the more you can toy somebody into kind of a dark place and then bounce them happy and then back down, it's like the slot machines in Vegas. So they figured that out really well. And if you look at this data, it's interesting. The data goes pretty flat until about 2010, which is when Snapchat and Instagram were released. And then you start to see a rise that starts to happen right after that in these young children. And then when you look at that last extreme, which is the sad and hopelessness, it is our friend TikTok in 2016 that came out. So this is correlational data. We can't do experiments where we take one of our children and we submerge them into a social media platform and we take one and we don't. So that's the only way you can have a true experiment. But the data, and there's another slide, this one is actually self-harm. So the blue line here is children that are committing self-harm, which would be anything qualified under cutting, burning, scratching, and disordered eating. Anorexia, bulimia is also under the self-harm. And then the bottom one is suicide. And if you look at the same data of when they came out and how they're perpetuated into our children, it is frightening to me as a mother and as a psychologist and as somebody who is a steward in this world to not bring this out into a bigger forum and have a conversation about it.
Yeah.
Because that's what kids are telling us. They're telling us that they're learning these things. I think that the statistic is like 90% of children who commit self-harm watched a video online about it. So, it's not something that we wake up and, our young children and they think they're gonna at some point try to find a razor and use it. It's the presentation of the information to them and the fact that can be something that will help them be relevant or help them feel better as a solution.
Yeah, and I think what's coming up next is the pandemic and its kind of impact on this, because we're already seeing these trends as we get close to 2020, and then suddenly we're all technology, we're all screens, and I seeing it in this context, that's horrifying. It's horrifying to me. So I wonder if we go to the next slide, because we have some updated numbers
On the
after this. Yeah.
Sorry, everyone. Do you want to be in charge or me?
Sure.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just taking over the whole thing.
It's okay. You go for it.
Okay. So one of the statistics, and this was what I started to see, this is Pew Research, which are a great source if you ever want to look up kind of what's happening in the world. They're out of DC, but 80% of kids, when I go into a school, I'll say, do you know someone who has been bullied, someone who's had suicidal thoughts, who has been impacted by pornography? I ask these questions, and typically those children, I would say about 80%, 90% sometimes, will raise their hands. And the administrators are always so horrified. But this is where I work on a day-to-day basis with these children. And if you're allowing your child online and we haven't put guidelines around it, they don't know what's wrong and what's right. And a perfect example, particularly with the pornography industry, is that they have learned that in our U.S. core curriculum, that in second grade, which is 8, which is the average age a child is presented their first image of pornography, they have attached ad bundles to historic figures. So if our children are given an assignment, which is in second grade, to look up an explorer, so Ponce de Leon or Sir Francis Drake, and they start searching that, it is attached to advertisements that will introduce pornography to them. And the fact that we know this is happening and the fact that we haven't stopped it from happening is what's so frustrating. And it's something that with my kids, I immediately, when they were little, I would say these things. And my son has told me that I am the most awkward person that he knows. And I said...
It's like a normal parent thing.
Yeah.
Probably, yeah.
I was like, it's weird. I talk about this all the time, and nobody's told me I'm awkward except for you. But it's a hard conversation to have with your kids, right? And it's whoever created Dick's Sporting Goods, right? You've got young boys that are looking for baseball bats, and they type in their sporting, they're looking up Dick's. What's going to pop up on the screen, right? So there's that natural kind of like innocuous ways that our kids are getting there, but our kids are being exposed. And if we're not getting ahead of it and having the conversation and at least understanding it ourselves, it can be dangerous.
Yeah.
You want to do the next one?
Yeah.
Okay. The second one of suicide, this is something that in my practice I can tell you exactly, I've had 19 families that have come in with me and have personally lost a child, all related to something that had happened online. And partly that's because I speak out on this in a national way, but partly because it's something that I lost my parent to suicide, so it's something that's near and dear to my heart. The numbers with the children, it's the second leading cause of death, and the numbers of our children that are younger and younger. We've had 2 in this past 6 months that were 8. And our children should never have even an understanding by that age of what was going on. But the amount of pain and hopelessness that's out there truly is, in my opinion, a reflection of how they don't have safe space. So as a kid, I was horribly bullied, and I had a terrible bus ride every day. But I could get off that bus, and I went home, and I had people around me that loved me, and I didn't have to continue hearing what I had done wrong, or my clothes were awful, or whatever it was on that day. So I think that the part of that is understanding the space that's needed and that love.
Yeah, and we'll talk about at the end the ways we can build those spaces, but I think that's a thing that if you're not a teenager now or don't know a teenager now, you don't realize, but the bullies are everywhere now, and they follow you everywhere because your phone is everywhere with you. And so the stuff they say is basically 24 hours. And as we know, the internet remembers everything, so everything that's said is just there forever. And so it just becomes this really toxic and deadly perpetuating cycle.
Right, without a vantage, right? As a teen, you feel like this is your world, and so you really don't know how to get out of it. The self-harming and suicidal thinking, you saw that on the CDC slide, that it's gone up 225% in the last 10 years. It is insane, the amount of kids that are participating in it. And it's almost like this little kind of tribe that they share with each other. And it is no longer what in psychology we would term typically as like a bipolar borderline behavior. These are just normal kids from good families, and they are not understanding how to emotionally regulate. And I think a lot of it is they don't have the time to figure out how to reset in that. So
yeah, and it's the and this I think we can all resonate with, that if you're kind of constantly attacked or feel constant anxiety, you need some kind of release. And if they're presented with self-harm as an option, again, without the vantage point and the kind of frontal lobe development, terrible
and
things
it
can
works.
happen.
I mean, the one thing that I will say is, like, if anyone knows people who have tattoos or like tattoos, like, you get one and then they say, like, it's kind of an addictive process. The endorphins that are released on an injury, if you have anxiety, and my belief is it's an issue of anxiety in our youth, but you have anxiety, the only competing force is your brain will only shift gears if it's relating to something that's more pivotal. So pain, if you create pain in yourself, that actually creates an endorphic release in your brain, and so that quashes the anxiety. So the problem is it works, and so they're very good at spreading information, and that's why it's going up so much. Whoops, I think there was one more. Wasn't there? Yeah. We just talked about this, the self-regulation and navigating the peer relationships. So many kids don't know how to talk about anything nowadays. It seems like I had a kid in my office on Wednesday this week, and I said, tell me about your family. And he's like, what do you want to know? And I said, well, what do your parents do? He's like, I don't, my dad puts a suit on. I said, what, is he in banking? I don't really know. And this is a 15-year-old boy who doesn't really know what his dad does for a living. So the level of disconnect and apathy, to me, is like they're pulling inward, and they're really not putting themselves out there to get to know the world.
Yeah. Well, I kind of alluded to this before we talked about the impact. This was all true before the pandemic, but then the pandemic, as we all experienced, drew us inside. I mean, talk about anxiety. It kind of turned up anxiety for everyone. And so we have some data here on the 2020-2021 school year, and just in that year alone, what we saw with some of the data.
So I'll show these fairly quickly. So Gaggle is a company that they have 1,500 school districts across the United States. They service over 5 million children in their database, and it's an AI technology that solely looks at what kids are putting in their academic work. So if your schools have Gmail or Google, or if they have Chromebooks, they basically go through and they look for this content. Has a child talked about suicide, self-harm? Has a child communicated violence towards someone else? Have they sent any nude pictures? Have they talked about drugs or alcohol? And is there any sort of like harassment going online? So those are the main 5 areas that Gaggle looks at. I think last year they had over 900 suicide notes that they were able to intercept and intervene on. So they're definitely a safety company, and I try to help them whenever I can, because they're doing an incredible amount of work to try to help keep our kids safe. But there's a 131% increase in student incidents. So those are the statistics there in terms of what was happening 2021. The elementary school, they broke it down for the very first time. I asked, can I just look at the little kids? And this was terrifying to me, because it skewed so much in terms of how much the little kids, once they were forced, so many of these kids weren't online pre-pandemic. And so what happens was that we handed everybody a device because we had to figure out a way to get through COVID. And the young children really didn't have any experience, and so you saw this huge increase in what they were communicating from before, because those devices weren't protected. And then 2022, the data went up another 40%. So if you're thinking about, it went up 131% right in the middle of the pandemic. It went up another 40% 2022. And so the things that I thought stood out was the fact that we had an increase in drugs and alcohol. For the first time ever, there was a decrease in sending nudes online. So hopefully that message is getting out that we shouldn't be doing that. But the violence and that is just reflective of what the student population is at that time. Yeah.
Well, again, I feel like a deep breath is in order. But we're going to move now to kind of talk about the reality, because you might be feeling, if you are a parent or if you know a teenager or a child, the first time I heard all these figures, my first reaction was like, I need to find every piece of technology and immediately put it in the garbage disposal. And so I think what would be good now is to talk about the reality of these technologies and these apps, just so we understand kind of what is out there and what people are dealing with. And then we can really think about how do we help as a community, as parents, and particularly what does it mean for us, because some of us don't know teenagers and but still want to keep ourselves safe. So what are the realities that our young people are dealing with these applications?
Well, I think it's a competition. So if you don't have teenagers or young children, we're still interfacing with them. They're working in stores and they're, out on the streets, driving cars around us, which is one of the terrifying, thoughts. I tell parents, I was like, what you do is what they will do. So if you as an adult are feeling pretty confident that you can text something, a response while you're driving a vehicle, and there's a kid in the car watching you, they 100% will turn into that teenager that's texting and driving. And we have a huge issue with distracted driving as one of the big ones. And that affects all of us, right? Because we're on the road with all of them. So I definitely think that one of the biggest issues is them really trying to figure out, has everybody heard IRL? IRL is in real life. That's how the teens talk about it. I sound like, yeah, so I have all this lingo that I can't really use anywhere because it's really it's a vernacular that nobody knows, but they do very well. But the real life world and this tech world it's an unfair competition. And so the realities are that we will never be able to compete against the tech build because they have too much power and they have too much control and understanding of how to make everything so exciting. From the colors on the screen, the notifications, the vibrations, all of those things is just a Pavlovian training for all of us to feel like that we're hooked in.
Yeah, well, it's something, and I'm going to toot Alice DeVries' horn in our youth ministry here at Christ Church, because I used to coordinate the youth ministry for a diocese, and I worked at a school before I came here. And one thing you see in youth ministry are two kind of models of doing youth ministry. One is the entertainment model, and the other is the kind of deeper spiritual growth and engagement. And I grew up in the entertainment model. I grew up in Young Life, where you come and you just kind of play games for most of the time, and it's a lot of fun, and everyone's there. But what we're seeing in the world now, it's what you just named. The church can't compete with entertainment, with the technology that's out there now. I mean, we feel that as adults, right? I can stream the entire Game of Thrones series in a weekend, and it has $1 million+ budget, and it's just the greatest thing that's ever been created for entertainment, if that's your thing. It's not going to compete with something that a church can do, unfortunately. And so what I want to toot Alice's horn about is what kids are hungry for, what we're all hungry for, is just to go deeper, to not be entertained all the time. We'll talk about this at the solutions, but what we invite kids into is to be present in real life, to be silent, to be still, because that's something that the technology just can't do. But that's my short little stump speech is, if we're getting in the game of entertainment, that's a losing battle. We're outgunned, we're outmatched. Christ Church doesn't have the budget to compete against TikTok when it comes to entertainment. And so I think we need to kind of look at what we're doing, and this conversation is super helpful for that. Okay, can we look at the apps themselves?
Sure. So COVID, 14 hours a day, children were online, and today, if you look nationally in the US, it's 11 hours a day that they're on some sort of platform. These are the main 5, so TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube, and this new one called Be Real. Be Real was an effort to kind of create a non-Instagram. Instagram is like a curated version of your life that we can edit and do all these things. Be Real is an app that sends you a note and says, you need to take a picture right now because I'm going to be real. So if I don't have makeup on or I'm wherever I am, but it chooses for you when you're going to take it. So for instance, if I had that and it came on while I'm doing this, of course I'm not going to respond, right? And I actually left my phone in your office, right? So I wouldn't even have known. It wouldn't even bother me that it would come in. However, if I got back and I saw that it was notified and I didn't post for an hour and a half, it'll say, oh, Lisa posted, but she was an hour and a half late, so it time shames you. And you're not allowed to see anybody else's post until you post first. So it's created this absolute need, and I see this frenetic like piece of like my kids and my teenagers. When they come into my office, their phones go into airplane mode, and I have a charger. This is one thing that I have a lot of churches do in the youth ministries, is they bring in charging towers, and then the kids can go and plug in their phones, and it's away from them, and they're getting charged, and that's kind of a trade-off on that
nice.
end. Yeah. But that's what I do in my office, so kids don't have their access. These are the next line that nobody. So first of all, my children, I'll just self-disclose, do not have any social media. Obviously, what I do for a living terrifies me. But my kids are not, quote unquote, typical kids either. Like, they don't fit in a normative way with the peer group. So I don't know if my experiment is right or wrong. But in disclosure, my kids also, go and build dirt ramps and jump bikes and do things that are outside, and I got a call last week about my son driving down the road. A mom said, I think I saw Colt driving down the road with a shovel on his handlebars. And I was like, I'm not really sure what to do. So I took a second. I was like, well, did he have a helmet on? And she said, yeah, he did. I was like, okay, it's fine. Can't be doing anything too terrible, right? So anyway, but I think that if you look at them, if my kids, any kids, you go into a school, I can literally line up, these kids have social media and these kids don't. I can see how they dress. I can see how they act. It just fundamentally changes them. The second line, house party, actually went out after COVID. That's been replaced by a new popular one called gas, which is about making you feel like you're important, gassing you up, which is terrible, because really all it does is it'll say who has the best hair, and then it'll have 4 names, and I can vote for who I think has the best hair. Well, as you can imagine, if you're one of those kids that don't get voted for, now you're not. It's kind of like an anonymous popularity contest. Kick. I would not want my kids on any of the second line. Kick is a end-to-end encryption app, and it's used highly with human trafficking and drug trade. We can't, as an investigative aspect, get into it. The heart is called Likey, and it essentially is a dating site for kids, or a hookup site for kids that they go on. It's supposed to be where do you like someone, but it's used really in inappropriate ways. And then Yik Yak is the little yak there, is an anonymous board that you can kind of say whatever you want about anyone. And their new motto, they rebranded, is Find Your Herd. And that means that if your child is on this app, it's going to tell you who's within 5 miles of that child, which is, to me, I worked in the FBI in the profiling unit and child abduction unit specifically. So that terrifies me, that we're basically mapping our children. Snapchat does the same thing. And then the last one is WhatsApp, which is also the end-to-end encryption. So again, a lot of the parent monitoring and the things that we can do to protect our kids, they aren't able to track those. So there's just really no fundamental reason your kids need to be in that. And then what was the last one? I think the last one is just the gaming. Sorry, the fast finger. Yeah, Xbox, PlayStation, and then the little purple one is called Discord. So Discord is a chat function. So your kids can use their gaming system to talk to friends that are online. But if they use those, there is some limitation to that. Discord, they can create servers and globally have anybody in the world. So a lot of the kids that I see that are the victims of like a phishing or alluring issue tend to be on a Discord app or things like that. And you have to think that what happens in the nefarious parts of our society, those people, and you can think about at any given day, there's about 1.4 million predators online. They're going to go directly to the places where our kids are. The same way that somebody would in real life go to a park or kind of find a kid that might be astray. So you just have to really be aware and have those conversations with your kids when they're on these apps.
Yeah. And I think it's really helpful to see the final line too, because again, we can have this idea of what all these platforms are and what kids are doing. But unfortunately, what we know about human nature is that if someone has a nefarious goal in mind, they will use any means necessary to get it. So that Xbox is not just gaming, it's gaming and all of these potential dangers as well. Okay. So I'm very mindful of our time.
Where do you want to go?
There's so much to talk about here, but we're going to pause for a second to talk about, we've been talking about technology as a gateway already, as a gateway to self-harm, to suicide, to body image issues, to any number of things. But I wonder if this is a good place to just mention the danger of technology for older adults as well. That it's not just teenagers. At Christ Church, I mean, y'all have gotten all the emails. We were the victims of a phishing expedition, I guess, from some scammers who were using technology in a way that could really hurt people. And they targeted a vulnerable segment of our population. Vulnerable in the sense of being really trusting and wanting to do good and not understanding the ways that these technologies work. So I wonder if you could add anything about older adults and the vulnerabilities there.
Sure. So a lot of times we've got it's this interesting generation where you're raising kids and then you have aging parents. So I see kind of both sides of it, but I have a large majority of my elderly population who haven't really understood that what I get online isn't specific to me, right? It could just be something that isn't about me as a person. It just was a mass email. They haven't been taught that, so they don't know that. So I've had multiple cases where literally thousands of dollars have been spent by people in the community that have found like this, Ukrainian child, teenager who can't eat, and the war is like, creating this whatever, and they'll send thousands of dollars, like, oh, I want to help them. And I'll have the child, the adult child, like the 50-year-old coming in and saying, I don't know what to do. Like, my dad keeps spending money, like, and he doesn't have it, right? And he thinks he's helping this, this war-torn country. And so to me, that's part of it, is like that, the need and the want to do good and understanding those parameters on it. The other thing is, I think that technology tends to strip away, in some ways, the relationships that we have with our children. They can be outsourced. So I always say tech is a tool, not a toy. So if your kids are going to talk to you, for instance, my 14-year-old son is very touchy and huggy, and I love him dearly. My daughter, who's 15, not a toucher. It's on her terms only, and it's rare, but she will send me the nicest and sweetest text messages. And so I can there's ways that you can use it for good and not. In the adult, like with husbands and wives even, I remember when the laptop came out, my husband and I had just been married not very long, and I thought it was so convenient to grab my laptop while I sat down next to him while he was watching some show and keep working. And I thought, and I just knew it. I was sitting there, I was like, oh, this is going to really probably ruin marriages. Because it's not healthy, right? We need to be engaged with each other. So I think it's just being mindful that technology can, in adults in normal ways, just, I guess, give us an exit from being in real life connections with people.
Yeah. And I think there are ways, as we kind of move to the solutions and what we can do to help, there are ways that technology does connect people in really beautiful ways. But I think what I'm hearing through all this is it's no replacement for real life connection. Because I'm a preacher, I have to get this in there. One thing about Christianity that's unique is the incarnation, the idea that God took on human flesh. And one thing that we're doing in all of this is almost excarnating ourselves out of human flesh into, I don't want to say the kind of make-believe world, but that's what it is, and it feels very real, and they're getting very good at making that feel real. We didn't even talk about VR and virtual reality and all those kind of things. So I think this is a good place to kind of move to solutions with the kind of headline, I think, being real life.
Right.
Real life is the solution.
To me, when you look at as a capacity as human, and this is Siegel's work in terms of mind, brain, and relationships. Mind is the part where we can cognitively think of something. The brain is that core of us. It's that autonomic system where we feel anxiety. And we may not know why we're feeling anxious or not, but that's like kind of the inside of where we are. We can think about things, but we have this like autonomic response system. And what Dan has found is that relationships specifically is the curative part. So how many people that we have that we're connected to your point, in families, like I grew up and I had not an easy childhood, but I had a grandmother. And so I always talk about the power of one. It doesn't have to be a huge cohort, but you need at least one relationship that will be saving to you, that will be comforting to you in order to cure that part of you so that you have that in real life and in person.
Yeah, and I hate that we're at the end of time because we could go on and on, but this is one thing we're working on here at Christ Church is wellness and well-being that we've seen out of the pandemic. Again, technology was great in some senses, that we did remain connected through the pandemic. I started at Christ Church in the pandemic, and so Zoom was a lifesaver because I got to know a lot of you through Zoom. But it's not a replacement for the actual in-person relationships where we can have that safe space.
I shared last night at dinner, there's a study that came out just 2 weeks ago, that they looked at the difference between a Zoom meeting and an in-person conversation with a brain and looking at where the sensory in the brain lights up. And they found that there's 9 separate sections that we have talking in person with each other, that the brain lights up when we're in person together. And there's only 1 area of the brain that lights up when we're in a Zoom call, which is really interesting, the technology. So the fact that they titled social media, it really isn't bearing out that it's social, and it's not helpful for us. Smart, but yeah. Should we go?
Yeah,
let's go. I always say I'm like Kevin Costner, I build stuff and hope that people listen. But is having a holistic approach to this issue, right? We have to do some education. We have to get peers on board. The best way to do that is get peer leadership to be their steward. I have asked in 10 years of public speaking in high schools and middle schools, how many of you have an older sibling or a younger sibling? And they'll raise their hands. I said, all right, everybody who's raising their hand, how many of you want your younger sibling to go on these platforms? And I've never not had every single hand go down. So they know it's bad, right? So we have to get them in part of this conversation, and that's what, Alice, we talked about last night. Diversion is, to me, the biggest issue. I used to say everything you do is public and permanent. I haven't said that for almost 6 years now because it's terrifying to think for a child, and it doesn't send the right message. What we have to teach them is we can, instead of getting them in trouble for making a mistake, we have to divert them, kind of like the restorative justice model, and say, here's what you did in this situation. Here's an example, a story or a vignette of it, and you can get back from that, and you can make better choices moving on. And then finally, community. I don't know where I would have been without having church in my background, and having gone, my grandmother took me to a different church every 6 months. She told me that world wars were fought over it and that everybody thinks they're right. And so for some reason, she thought we should go figure it out together. I always got a Dairy Queen ice cream cone at the end, so there was always a payoff. But I think that we're missing that part for children. Like we've lost that, and how that's important for our children to understand that community piece.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and then the last slide has tips for home, and I will say, because we're bumping up against time, I didn't plan it this way. This is a good plug to get her books. If you want to know more detail about all of this, and particularly tips for home, the books are a great place, and we'll have a discount code.
Actually, it's just a free, it'll be free for everyone.
Cool.
So I'll get you a link that you can download them online.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
the ebooks.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So we'll have the links so you can download those ebooks. But as we leave, I wonder what some tips for us who now want to go home and put all our phones in the garbage disposal.
The biggest tip, I mean, all of these obviously routines and community, and have somebody else on your island. I fortunately am I think the captain of the island because my kids don't have social media. So there's other friends that look to us and they'll say, well, does Colt have social media yet? And so if you have one other parent that's on board with you, like, we don't want to do this until this age, can we do this together? That is always really helpful. That's the biggest piece, if you're not in it alone. We did Tech Free Tuesday in my house, so identify a day or a space that you participate with your child in that. My kids loved every single time they caught me on a Tuesday answering a call or on my computer. And for some reason, it was like a boot camp. It's like, all right, you have to do 50 sit-ups or whatever. And so kept me in shape, but I did get caught a couple of times. But you make it fun. You know, this is about learning how to use technology with balance and not outsourcing yourselves. It's doable. And as families and as community members, you know, to me, like, if I see, I'm probably super annoying, but if I go into a restaurant and I see kids on iPads during a family dinner, typically I'll go over and say hello to them and say, yo, your kids are so beautiful. And I try to, like, engage them and try to get them to recognize, like, this is not okay. So find those little moments that you can be an influence in the world and be a change and support people instead of shaming people is what I find works, because it is hard to be in the society today with the competition of the online for all of us. So it's recognizing it's okay to have moments where you're by yourself and have those free time to think and be with yourself.
Yeah. Well, before we wrap up, I will say Lent starts on Wednesday. Ash Wednesday is coming up. And so, if you haven't thought about what you want to give up for Lent, this might be a good place to start. Dr. Lisa, thank you so much. Can we get a round of applause for...
Thank you. Thank you.
We're very grateful.